Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about a more contemporary issue than I normally do. Today is going to be a response to the SBC and Al Mohler. If you don't know who Al Mohler is, this is him. Al Mohler is currently serving as the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. So today I'm talking about the proposed amendment that Al Mohler has created for the SBC meeting, which I believe takes place next week. He wants to add an amendment that says that the SBC does not act to affirm, appoint, or endorse a woman serving in the office or function of a pastor, elder, overseer, such as preaching to the assembled congregation. Now, at first, this may not come as a big surprise to anyone who is familiar with the SBC, as they have a long history of restricting women's roles in the church, to the point that they kicked out Saddleback Church many years ago over this issue. However, in conversations with Al Mohler, what has arisen is some very interesting aspects of his amendment and what he is proposing. And I'm going to discuss that and cover that. I do want to be upfront. There are two important topics that I think that are related to this issue that I'm not going to cover in depth in this video, but would be happy to do another video on if there is interest. The first is the idea of complementarianism. And while I don't think this is a particularly helpful name, I do think that the main issues in complementarianism run with the idea that men and women have separate roles. And the role for men is often labeled as the leader, the authority, the provider, the person in charge, the person who makes the decisions. And often what happens is the role of the woman is very much the opposite. She is supposed to be quiet and submissive and meek. And depending on what space you're in, where they use this type of language, you will get more or less of that. But ultimately, I think this is a very rotten system. I did a deep dive into it about a year ago, and I found the statistics, the research was very troubling to me. I think it is a system that produces bad fruit, and I think there is a lot of research to support that. The second issue, which kind of goes along with complementarianism, is the phrase biblical womanhood, which gets thrown around a lot in these spaces and is usually associated with the idea that women in the Bible were meek wives and mothers, and that their role was to fulfill that. However, that is not true. We have several examples of women who do not function this way in Scripture. Also women who do hold authoritative positions like judge, prophet, deacon, and apostle. So one of the things in Al Mohler's discussion of his position has revealed one aspect I do completely agree with. And he speaks about how some churches will say that they don't have women pastors, but they're going to have women shepherds. And that really, my word's not his, this is a nuance game. This is a word game, a semantics game. And it's not something that I see as endorsed by Scripture. In fact, I co-wrote an article about this because I don't understand that if you have a man in a position and he is called a pastor, and you have a woman in the same position and she is called a director, I actually think you just have a woman pastor that you refuse to give the title, respect, and authority to. The name doesn't change what she is. And I don't think Scripture supports this position either. I don't think God is up there saying, yes, you can have women pastors as long as you don't call them pastors. I think most Christians can agree that Scripture either says women can be pastors or it says they can't. But to have this weird middle ground where they can be directors, but they can't be pastors even though they're doing the same job as a man who would be given the title of pastor, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I don't think it's very honest of us to do that. So I come to this idea of the position that I've sometimes heard that, well, we know men can be pastors, and so we're not sure about women, so it's just the safe option to exclude women. But I believe this to be a logical fallacy, because on one hand, they're correct if God says through the Bible that women are not supposed to be pastors, and we decide that we don't care and that women can be pastors because we want that, then yes, I would say that's fair to say that we are doing something sinful. However, the opposite is also true. If women are called to be pastors and we are telling women that they are not allowed to fulfill their God-ordained calling, we are in just as much sin. Because either way, we are disobeying God. There is no safe option here. There is no, we can say that men can be pastors and women can't because it's safe, that we're free from sin. That's just not true. Restricting someone from a position, from doing the task that God commanded them to do, is sin. And we need to be really honest about that. So let's get into some of what Al Mohler is talking about here. I read you the statement. It seems very clear, very straightforward, but in some of his interviews, he has expanded it a bit. And so one of the aspects that he expands it on is that women cannot answer questions pertaining to sermons in podcasts, which this is probably the part that has upset the most people, perhaps rightfully so, because it seems to be a weird line to draw. What is perhaps even more problematic about this is that it's on the back of the great sex scandal that the SBC has had over the past several years. And I have searched, and please feel free to correct me if there is more being done than I think. From my Google search, I have seen very few efforts to try to rectify the damage that has been done from these sex scandals, where if you read the reports, it talks about women not being taken seriously. Many of the scandals also involve children, but when people raise issues, they're not being taken seriously, or they're being taken as like a hostile force that's coming against the pastor in the church. So reading these stories, hearing some of the trauma, it's rather heartbreaking, to be honest. As far as I can tell, there has been very little progress done in the SBC to address these concerns. And so what it appears, especially to outsiders, is that the SBC cares a whole lot more about making sure women can't be preachers than they care about making sure women aren't sexually abused by their pastors. And that is something that the preacher boys say a little more explicitly, which I will put in the description box below. Because as always, I will fill the description box with links and sources, because please do not take my word for any of this. Feel free to go and research it yourself. And I believe this comment came from Bare Marriage, but I couldn't find it on their YouTube. So I will link their YouTube, but if anyone knows where it came from, please let me know and I'll fix it in the description box. But they talk about how when there is a lot of sexual scandal, if you don't actually want to fix the problem, a great way to handle it is to make the box around women smaller. Now, the SBC already has a box around women saying what they can and cannot do in the church. But if we limit that even further and we say, well, women can't get on podcasts and speak about certain things, then we decrease the likelihood of hearing about the abuse. We decrease the likelihood of hearing the complaints, the problems. And it makes it really easy to say there are no complaints or problems when there are quite a few. That is something as well to consider, though granted, I do want to be fair. From my reading, from my understanding, Al Mohler did not claim that women could not be on podcasts at all, but he does restrict what they can say theologically. And if you're in a denomination that already believes that women cannot hold certain roles, such as pastor, it's already a great power differential to speak out against that, and then to limit what women can say theologically does limit that even more. While I do not believe that is an intended outcome by Mohler, it is definitely one that will come to pass. One of the other aspects I want to discuss about Al Mohler, because I do believe it applies here, is his view of women as a whole, because I do think within these systems that it does promote certain ways of viewing women. So for example, you may be familiar with the name Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson is a very controversial pastor. who has made it clear that he does not believe that women should have the right to vote. While Al Mohler does not agree with him on this, it is not from any sort of theological or moral ground, as far as I can tell. It says that he considers it politically implausible for that to happen, but that he does sympathize with it to a certain degree. And so I think at this point, the honest conclusion is that if we go down this route, the people who believe this do not see women as people. They do not see them as autonomous individuals, but rather extensions of their husbands. And if they do not have husbands, they should get husbands. And this is a problem in general because of the dynamics that we start to find in churches that have this type of ideology. We can look at trends and we see that what appears to be happening, I don't think it has been proven yet, but we do see a strong correlation with the percentage of people who are entering these type of spaces. And what we seem to be finding is that these type of churches are growing from young men who are consuming a lot of the Monosphere, Redpill type of content. And everyone else is leaving these spaces. There is, in particular, a trend of women moving out of spaces that promote this type of ideology. And I want to say that it's very easy to dismiss these women as not liking this type of teaching, of just rejecting what Scripture says. But in talking with them and hearing their stories, that's not the case. In fact, Jubilee Dawn has a few videos, maybe a mini series called Why Are Women Leaving the Church? And it's just constant stories of sexual harassment, sexual assault, being asked to do the same job as men without any sort of title or authority, being diminished, being demeaned. And that is a very consistent pattern. A response I hear is, well, we're Christians, so we're not supposed to strive for any positions or titles or authority. And I can go there. I can agree with you, but I think we have to be consistent. So as soon as we go to our churches and we tell the male pastors and elders and deacons that they no longer have titles or authority or positions, then I think it's fair to say the same to women. But until we do that, until we sit and think, have I ever said this to a man in this position? And honestly answer that, then I don't think we can say it to women who've been doing the same jobs without any sort of recognition and without being offered a voice at the table. And one more aspect about that piece is, in my own experience of talking to ex-vangelicals or people who have left these type of church spaces, it is not because they don't feel some type of conviction to follow Christ. In fact, many of the women I've met who would consider themselves ex-vangelicals, I've met in spaces of theological education. They're going to learn more about Christ, about the Bible, but they've come to the conclusion that these things they were taught, that they were essentially the things that the Bible was weaponized against them for were false. And that's a real pattern. As people learn, as people grow, as they read church history, read the original languages, as they encounter Christians from other countries, a lot of these aspects fade away. And I think that's something that we need to grapple with. And unfortunately, a lot of the ex-vangelicals I have personally spoken to do come from a Baptist background. And if you're wondering why I'm talking about this, I am not a Baptist. I do not go to a Baptist church, but I live in what I sometimes call Baptist country, where the majority of the churches are Baptist. If they're not Southern Baptist, they're Independent Fundamental Baptist, or Free Will Baptist, or Primitive Baptist, or some other type of Baptist. So there are lots of Baptist churches where I live, and to the degree that they even influence the non-denominational churches. The non-denominational churches here have a Baptist flavor to them because of how prevalent the SBC is in my area. So the choices made by the SBC next week will impact me because of where I live and because of all the people I know and love who do attend SBC churches, who are in those spaces, and who could very well be limited by this amendment. In closing, I do want to read a little bit from BaptistNews.com. There's an article, Why Mohler's Take Against Female Podcasters Misses the Mark. And I just wanted to read a little bit from this article because I found it so pertinent to the real life consequences that can be brought about from this. And it says, additionally, we are concerned that Mohler's views on female podcasters attempt to entrench a repressive authoritarianism and represent the very worst forms of toxic masculinity, misogyny, and abusive patriarchal power structures. We take great umbrage with Mohler's views on female podcasters and postulate that restricting women from public scriptural interpretation essentially gatekeeps theological discourse. It grants men an exclusive authoritarian monopoly on how the Bible and Christian theology are understood and communicated. So I would just say to you, if you are part of this at all, if you have any say in what is going to happen in the SBC in the future, please consider these things, because the decisions made here have real world impact and they can bring a lot of harm and trauma and abuse, because even if that is not the intention, that is what this system can very easily bring about. So thank you guys so much for your time. As I said, I will put everything in the description box below. And yeah,